After my heart surgery, I returned to my $15 million beachfront mansion, only to find my daughter had changed the locks, holding a fake power of attorney. She said, "This house belongs to us now. Don't come back." My son-in-law smirked. "You belong in a nursing home, not a palace." I didn't argue. I just smiled and walked away. They thought they had taken everything from me, until the day they opened that door again and discovered the secret I had been protecting for years. I'm genuinely grateful you're here with me today on Dad Family Revenge. Before we go further, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments. I read every single one, and you'd be surprised how far this community reaches. This story contains fictional elements crafted for entertainment and reflection. Names and locations are coincidental, but everything this story is trying to tell you matters. The taxi smelled like pine air freshener and old leather, and I sat in the back with a small wooden music box on my lap, turning it over in my hands, the way I'd done 100 times in that hospital bed. 23 days. That's how long they'd kept me at Sarasota Memorial after the bypass surgery. 23 days of beige walls, blood pressure cuffs, and nurses who called me Mr. Whitmore in that careful voice people use around the elderly and the fragile. I was neither. But I was 67, and I'd just had my chest cracked open, so I supposed I could allow them that. The driver turned onto Pelican Shore Drive, and I felt something loosen in my chest that had nothing to do with the surgery. Margaret had loved this road. She used to roll the window down even in August, even when the heat was enough to make your eyes water, just to smell the salt air coming off the Gulf. I pressed my hand flat against the music box and told myself I was ready to go home. Then I saw the suitcase. It was sitting on the brick sidewalk outside the main gate, my gate, the one I'd had custom built from wrought iron 15 years ago. My brown leather suitcase, the one Margaret had given me for our 35th anniversary with my initials stamped in gold near the handle. H.W. It was standing upright like someone had set it there carefully, which almost made it worse. "Sir," the driver said, "is this the right address?" "Yes," I said. "Pull up to the gate, please." Two men I had never seen before were standing just inside the entrance. Large men, dressed in the kind of black polo shirts that security companies order in bulk. One of them stepped forward as I got out of the cab, and he held up one hand with the practiced calm of someone who'd done this before. "I'm sorry, Mr. Whitmore. You're not permitted entry at this time." My heart didn't race. My hands didn't shake. I felt something cold and very clear move through me instead, the way ice water feels going down on a hot day, sharp, then settling. "I see," I said. "And who authorized that?" Before he could answer, the front door of my house opened. Emily came out first. She was wearing a cream-colored blouse and linen trousers, and her hair was done the way she wore it for important meetings. She was holding a manila folder against her chest, like a shield, and when she saw me standing at the gate with my hand still on the music box, she smiled. Not warmly. The way someone smiles when a negotiation has already concluded in their favor. Daniel appeared behind her. He was holding a glass of orange juice at 9:30 in the morning, and he leaned one shoulder against the doorframe as though he owned it. As though he had always owned it. "Dad," Emily said, coming down the front steps. "I'm glad you're out. I really am. But we need to talk about the arrangements going forward." She opened the folder and held out a document. I took it with both hands and read the top line. Durable power of attorney. My signature was on the bottom. I recognized the loops of my own handwriting, the way I'd always curled the tail of the W. But the words above it were wrong. They were not the words I had signed. I had signed a limited power of attorney, a narrow document. specific. Bills and maintenance only while I was in the hospital. I remembered the exact conversation with my own attorney, the specific limitations we had built into that document, like guardrails. This was not that document. My chest tightened, and for a moment I felt the ghost of the surgical pain flare behind my sternum. I breathed through it. "Emily," I said, keeping my voice level. "This isn't what I signed." She didn't flinch. She didn't look away. She said, "It's what's on file, Dad. It gives me full authority to manage the property while you recover. The lawyers have reviewed it." Daniel pushed off the doorframe and walked toward the gate with that loose, unhurried stride he used when he was feeling confident. He looked at me over Emily's shoulder and said, "Look, Harold, let's be honest with each other. A man your age alone in a $15 million property. It's not practical. My parents are moving in this weekend. They'll take care of the place." He paused, swirling the orange juice slowly. "Honestly, you belong in a care facility, not a palace like this. It's time to be realistic." Emily touched his arm, not to stop him, I realized. To steady herself. I stood there on the sidewalk outside my own gate, holding a document I had never signed, and I looked at my daughter's face. She was waiting for me to argue, to raise my voice, to threaten. I could see it in the way she held her shoulders braced and ready. I didn't give her that. I tucked the document under my arm, picked up my suitcase with my free hand and said, "I understand." Then I turned and walked back toward the waiting cab. But as I passed through the front hall on my way to retrieve a second bag I'd left inside, I glanced down the corridor toward the basement stairs. The door was slightly open. In the dim light, at the bottom of the steps, I could see the shapes of large wooden crates stacked against the far wall. Heavy ones, marked with symbols I didn't recognize. They had not been there before I went into the hospital. I kept walking. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. But I did not forget what I had seen. The hotel room was on the 4th floor of a place called the Harborview Inn, 3 miles from Pelican Shore Drive, and it smelled like industrial detergent and someone else's life. I sat on the edge of the queen bed with my brown suitcase still zipped beside me and Margaret's music box open on the nightstand, its small brass mechanism catching the lamplight. I hadn't wound it. I just needed to see it open. The drive over had been quiet. The cab driver, bless him, had read the room and kept the radio off. I'd sat in the back with the forged document on my lap, reading it again and again the way you read something, when your brain keeps refusing to absorb what your eyes are clearly showing it. Every word was precise. Every clause was airtight. Whoever had altered that document had known exactly what they were doing. The wooden crates kept coming back to me. I'd seen them for maybe 4 seconds, long enough for my brain to register the details and file them somewhere urgent. 6 crates, maybe 7. Solid wood banded with metal straps. Each one stenciled with alphanumeric codes I didn't recognize. Not moving boxes, not furniture. The kind of containers you see in documentaries about shipping, about cargo, about things that cross borders in the dark. They had not been in that basement before my surgery. I was certain of that, the way you're certain of things that belong to you, the particular geography of your own home, the specific inventory of every room you've lived in for 11 years. I picked up my phone and called Marcus Hill. He answered on the second ring, which told me he'd been awake. "Mr. Whitmore." His voice was the same as it had always been, low-measured, the voice of a man who had spent 25 years managing the details of other people's lives without ever making those people feel managed. "I heard you were discharged today." "I was," I said. "Marcus, I need to ask you something directly, and I need you to answer me the same way." "Of course, sir." "The wooden crates in the wine cellar. The ones with the metal banding and the stenciled codes. I paused. How long have they been there? The silence on his end lasted exactly long enough to tell me that the question didn't surprise him. Sir, Marcus said, and his voice dropped half a register. I think this is a conversation we should have in person. Tonight, if you're willing. My heart knocked hard against my ribs, not from fear, but from the specific dread of a man who has just realized that the thing he suspected might be true is in fact considerably worse than he suspected. Where are you? I asked. 20 minutes away, he said. I've been 20 minutes away since 4 o'clock this afternoon. That hit me somewhere behind the sternum harder than I expected. He'd been waiting. He hadn't called to announce himself, hadn't pushed, hadn't presumed. He had simply positioned himself nearby in case I needed him, the way he'd done with everything for 25 years, quietly, completely, without ever requiring acknowledgement. Room 412, I said. Come up. He arrived at 11:03. I know because I watched the digital clock on the nightstand tick over to 11:04 as he knocked. He was wearing a gray jacket over a white shirt, and he was carrying a small black duffel bag, and when I opened the door, he looked at me the way people look at someone they're genuinely relieved to see standing upright. You look better than I expected, he said. I feel worse than I look, I told him. Come in. He sat in the chair by the window and set the duffel bag on the table between us. He didn't open it immediately. Instead, he pressed both palms flat on the table, drew a long breath, and said, Before I show you what's in here, I want to explain something. Because I need you to understand that what I did because I was afraid. And I want you to know that the fear turned out to be justified. My throat tightened. Go ahead, Marcus. 3 months before Miss Emily let me go, he said. And I noticed the careful way he said, let me go, the dignity he preserved in the phrasing. I began to notice things. Mr. Daniel asking questions about the wine cellar, about the drainage corridor behind it, about the private dock at the back of the property. He met my eyes directly, and I could see the strain he'd been carrying behind them, the weight of a man who had known something was wrong and had no one to tell. He asked me once how often the dock was inspected by the county. I told him annually. He nodded like that was good news. My stomach dropped. I didn't have proof, Marcus continued. But I had 25 years of watching people in that house, and something was wrong. So I made a copy. He unzipped the duffel and placed a small external hard drive on the table between us. The house has 2 camera systems, Mr. Whitmore. The new one Miss Emily knew about and disabled, and the original backup system you had installed when you first renovated, the one running on the separate server in the utility room. She didn't know it existed. I stared at the hard drive. How many times? I asked. Marcus's jaw tightened. 17 documented instances in 6 months, he said. And I don't believe that's where it started. I plugged the hard drive into my laptop, with hands that were steadier than they had any right to be, the footage loaded in folders organized by date. Marcus had labeled each one with a timestamp and a single-word delivery. 17 folders. 17 nights. The earliest dated back 6 months, 4 months before my surgery, 2 months before Emily had even raised the subject of the limited power of attorney. They had been planning this long before they needed the paperwork. I opened the first file. The wine cellar camera had a wide angle positioned in the upper corner above the old rack. Margaret had loved the one she'd had shipped from a vineyard in Napa because she liked the smell of the wood. The footage was grainy in the way of backup systems, timestamp burning white, in the lower right corner. 3 men I had never seen before were carrying a wooden crate down the cellar stairs. They moved with this practiced efficiency of people who had done this many times, no talking, no fumbling, just the mechanical rhythm of men doing a job they knew cold. A fourth man stood near the drainage corridor at the back of the cellar, holding the access panel open. He had his back to the camera, but his build and the way he stood, weight on the left foot, right shoulder, slightly dropped, turned my stomach completely over. Daniel. I knew his posture the way you know the handwriting of someone who's lived in your house. How long did you know? I asked Marcus, and my voice came out rougher than I intended, scraped raw by something I didn't have a clean name for yet. Marcus leaned forward in the chair, his elbows on his knees, and pressed his hands together so hard his knuckles went pale. I suspected for 4 months, he said. I didn't know not the way you mean until I saw the third delivery. By then I'd already started copying the files. He exhaled hard through his nose. I should have called you sooner, Mr. Whitmore. I've lost sleep over that. A great deal of sleep. You didn't know what you had, I said. Nobody, he agreed. But I knew it was wrong. And I knew that if I said something inside that house, it would disappear. He looked at the laptop screen where the footage was still running. The men, the crates, the silent efficiency of it all. Everything gets very quiet in that house when something needs to disappear. I closed the laptop because I couldn't watch anymore without my chest beginning to do something alarming, and I pressed the heels of my hands against my eyes and breathed the way the cardiac nurses had taught me. Slow in, slow out. Let the heart find its own rhythm. Margaret had been in that house while this was happening. She had been upstairs in the bedroom with the blue curtains she'd picked out herself, sleeping the difficult sleep of someone whose body was working very hard just to keep going. And 2 floors below her in the cellar, she'd never been strong enough to visit. In those final months, her son-in-law had been running shipments through the drainage corridor in the dark. Something hot moved up through my chest and into my throat, and I swallowed it back down because getting angry right now would not help anyone, least of all me. My phone rang. The screen said Nora and I felt something in me that had been clenched for hours, release just slightly. The specific physical relief of knowing that the one person you need most is already calling. Nora was my younger sister. 63 years old, sharp as a letter opener, and the only person on earth who had known me longer than Margaret had. She lived in Atlanta, and she called me every Sunday without fail, and the fact that she was calling on a Thursday night told me she'd heard. Harold James Whitmore, she said the moment I picked up, and I could hear that her voice was thick, that she'd been crying before she dialed. You tell me right now that you are somewhere safe. Room 412, Harborview Inn, I said. I'm safe. I'm at the airport, she said. I land at 6:45. Don't you dare try to talk me out of it. The tightness behind my sternum eased another degree. I wasn't going to, I said. Good. A pause, and then her voice cracked just slightly at the edges. Harold, what did she do? I looked at Marcus across the small hotel table. He was watching me with the careful attention of a man who understood that some conversations needed to happen and some wounds needed air before they could begin to close. More than I knew, I said, but I'm starting to find out the shape of it. You're not doing this alone, Nora said, and it wasn't a question. No, I said, I'm not, after I hung up. Marcus looked at me steadily, his jaw set, his eyes carrying the particular expression of a man who has made a decision and is at peace with it. Whatever comes next, Mr. Whitmore, he said, I'm here until it's finished. My eyes stung unexpectedly, the sudden heat of it catching me off guard, the way real gratitude sometimes does when it arrives at the exact moment you need it most. Thank you, Marcus, I said. And I meant it in a way that 25 years of professional courtesy had never quite let me say before. She knocked at 7:12, and when I opened the door, Nora walked straight in and put both arms around me without saying a single word, just held on the way she used to when we were kids, and something had gone badly wrong. The kind of hug that doesn't ask anything of you except that you stay upright. I let myself have it for about 4 seconds. Then I patted her back and said, "You made good time from the airport." She pulled away and looked at my face with the fierce, assessing look she'd been giving me since we were children. The look that meant she was cataloging exactly how bad things actually were versus how bad I was willing to admit. Her eyes were red-rimmed and slightly swollen, and she'd clearly been crying on the plane, but her jaw was set and her shoulders were back, and that was the most Nora thing about her. She cried, and then she squared up. "You look thin," she said. "I just had heart surgery." "You looked thin before the surgery." She set her bag down on the chair Marcus had vacated an hour earlier and turned to face me fully. "Harold, tell me everything. From the beginning, and don't you dare edit it to protect my feelings." So I told her. All of it. The suitcase at the gate. The forged document. Daniel's voice saying, "You belong in a care facility, not a palace like this." The wooden crates in the basement. Marcus and the hard drive. 17 deliveries in 6 months. The drainage corridor behind the wine cellar. I talked for 20 minutes straight, and Nora sat on the edge of the bed and listened without interrupting, which was a considerable act of self-control for a woman who had interrupted me regularly since 1963. When I finished, she pressed her lips together so hard they went white. Then she said, "That man stood in your home and told you that you belong in a care facility." "He did. While drinking your orange juice." It appeared to be yes. Nora stood up abruptly and walked to the window and stood there with her back to me, her hands gripping the windowsill, and I could see from the set of her shoulders that she was working very hard not to say several things she would technically mean, but later regret. After a moment she turned around, and her eyes were bright with tears she was absolutely refusing to shed right now. "I have something for you," she said. "I've had it for 14 months, and I've been waiting for the right moment, and I think—" Her voice broke slightly, just at the edges. "I think Margaret knew what the right moment would look like. Even if neither of us did." She reached into the inner pocket of her carry-on and produced a cream-colored envelope slightly worn at the corners from being handled and moved and carried. My name was on the front in Margaret's handwriting. The particular slant of her letters, the way she always wrote the H in Harold, with a small flourish at the top that she'd developed in her 20s and never changed. My hands were not steady when I took it. "She gave it to me 6 weeks before she passed," Nora said softly. And now the tears were coming, whether she wanted them or not, tracking quietly down both cheeks. She said, "Give this to Harold when he calls you first, not before. When he calls you, because that means he's ready to hear it." I sat down on the edge of the bed, because my legs had made a quiet executive decision about bearing weight. The envelope opened cleanly. One page both sides written in the careful hand of someone who knew their strength was limited, and chose every word accordingly. "Harold, if you're reading this, something has gone wrong that I tried to warn you about and couldn't find the right words for. You know how I am about words. I always thought there was more time. Emily worries me. Not because she is bad. I don't believe she is bad. But because she has always wanted more than she has, and she married a man who is very good at wanting things on other people's behalf. I have watched Daniel look at this house the way certain people look at things that aren't theirs. I've never told you because you love her, and I didn't want to be the person who put a shadow on that. I should have told you. That's my mistake, and I'm sorry for it. The house was never the point, Harold. Not the one in Napa we almost bought, not the apartment in the city, not this one. I never needed the address. I needed you to come home. You always did, eventually. That was enough. Don't let them make you small. You built everything you have from nothing, and it belongs to you, and what you do with it should be your decision made in your own time for your own reasons. I love you. I have loved you since you showed up 41 years ago with that terrible haircut and that look on your face like you already knew. M. My throat closed completely. I folded the letter with hands that were shaking, genuinely shaking, the tremor moving all the way up to my elbows, and I pressed it flat against my chest, against the surgical scar, against the place where my heart was doing its repaired and imperfect best. Nora sat down beside me and took my hand in both of hers and held it, and I let myself feel the full weight of it. The grief and the fury and the love all arriving at the same moment, crashing into each other in my chest until I couldn't tell them apart. She knew, I said when I could speak again. She knew, Nora confirmed. Her voice was wrecked and she didn't bother to hide it. She also knew you'd figure it out. She just wanted to make sure you heard it from her first. I sat there for a long time, with the letter against my heart and my sister's hand in mine. Then I reached over and wound the music box. The small, clear notes rose into the hotel room air, the melody Margaret had loved since before I knew her name, and Nora made a sound that was half laugh and half sob and gripped my hand tighter. "All right," I said finally. "I need a lawyer." Amelia Grant's office was on the 12th floor of a building downtown that looked out over Sarasota Bay, and the view was so similar to the one from my own living room that sitting across from her desk felt like a small, precise cruelty. The water was the same color. The angle of the morning light was the same. I kept my eyes on her face instead. She was in her mid-50s, with close-cropped silver hair and reading glasses she wore pushed up on her forehead, like a second set of eyes. She had been recommended to me by the attorney who'd handled my company sale 6 years ago, someone with no connection to Emily, no connection to Daniel, no connection to anyone in my immediate orbit. That had been my first condition. No shared history. Nora sat beside me. She had insisted, and I hadn't argued, because arguing with Nora before 8 in the morning was an energy expenditure I couldn't afford. I laid both documents on Amelia's desk. The original limited power of attorney, the one I had actually signed with the specific limitations my previous attorney, and I had built into it carefully. And the durable power of attorney that Emily had produced at the gate, the one bearing my signature, above words I had never agreed to. Amelia put on her reading glasses and looked at both documents for a long time without speaking. She moved them side by side. She held the durable POA up toward the window light. Then she set it down, took her glasses off, and looked at me with the direct, undecorated expression of someone who is about to say something you need to hear clearly. "Mr. Whitmore," she said, "whoever altered this document committed a felony. Under Florida Statute 817, criminal forgery of a power of attorney is a third-degree felony. If your daughter knew about this alteration, and given that she presented it at the gate, the implication is difficult to avoid. She is potentially criminally liable as well." Nora's hand found my forearm under the table and gripped it hard. I felt her nails through my shirt sleeve. "What can we do?" I asked. Amelia was already writing. "Several things, and we're going to do them simultaneously. First, I'm filing a lis pendens on the property today." She said it the way surgeons describe procedures: calm, specific, no wasted motion. A lis pendens is a formal legal notice that tells the entire world a property is in dispute. It attaches to the deed and makes it effectively impossible to sell, transfer, refinance, or encumber that property without the court's involvement. As of this afternoon, nobody is moving that villa anywhere. Good, I said. Second, I'm filing a petition to revoke power of attorney with the circuit court. The original limited POA you signed has already expired by its own terms. Your hospitalization period is over. The durable POA is a forgery, and we will argue it in court. We'll have both documents forensically examined. She made another note. Third, and I want to be careful here, you mentioned there may be activity on the property that goes beyond the real estate issue. The wooden crates, I said. Tell me about those. I told her everything Marcus had shown me. The footage, the 17 deliveries, the drainage corridor, the private dock at the back of the property. Amelia listened without interrupting, and as I spoke, I watched her expression shift in a way that told me she was recalibrating the scope of what she was dealing with. The slight tightening around her eyes, the way her pen slowed and then stopped entirely. When I finished, she said, I need to make a phone call before we go any further. There's someone I want to bring in. She paused. But first, my assistant spoke this morning with a man named Carlos Rivera. Does that name mean anything to you? It didn't. Mr. Rivera is a licensed locksmith, Amelia said. He was hired by your daughter approximately 1 week after your surgery to rekey the entire property. Standard locks gate access the guest entrance. She folded her hands on the desk. Mr. Rivera tells us that when he looked up the property in his company's records to confirm the work order, he found your name as the registered owner on file from a previous service call 11 years ago. He felt the situation was his word irregular. So before he completed the job, he made an additional key set and mailed it to the address on file. Nora made a sharp sound beside me, something between a laugh and a disbelieving exhale. He mailed it to my old office address, I said, slowly working through it, which forwards to my P.O. box, which is how we have it now. Amelia confirmed, and she opened her desk drawer and placed a small manila envelope in front of me. Inside were 2 keys on a plain ring. My gate, my front door. Mr. Rivera is willing to provide a formal statement. He said, and I'm quoting him directly, I wasn't sure at the time. I'm sure now. I picked up the keys. They were ordinary keys, the kind that cost $3 to duplicate at a hardware store, and holding them made my throat ache in a way I hadn't expected. Something that small. Something that simple. A man I had never met doing the right thing for no reason, except that it was the right thing. Who's the phone call? I asked. Amelia looked at me steadily. His name is Ryan Cole. He's former federal law enforcement specialized unit cultural property crimes. Art theft, antiquities, trafficking, that category. She picked up her phone. If those crates contain what I think they might contain, Mr. Whitmore, this stopped being a family dispute some time ago. My heart knocked once hard against my ribs. Make the call, I said. Ryan Cole called at 6:47 the following morning, and the first thing he said was not hello. Mr. Whitmore, do you know a physician named James Whitfield? I was standing at the hotel room window with a cup of coffee that had gone cold, watching the early light move across the bay. The question landed in my chest like something dropped from a height. I know him, I said. He was my wife's doctor for the last 3 years of her life. A pause on Ryan's end, the particular kind of pause that isn't empty, that is full of something the other person is deciding how to say. He filed a cognitive assessment report on you, Ryan said, dated 4 days after your surgery. The report concludes that you exhibit significant signs of post-operative cognitive decline and are, quote, potentially unable to manage complex financial and property decisions independently. The coffee cup in my hand cracked against the windowsill, not hard enough to break, but hard enough that the sound made Nora sit up sharply from the other bed where she'd been sleeping. Harold, she said. What is it? I held up one hand and give me a minute and pressed the phone harder against my ear. Whitfield filed that report, I said. James Whitfield. Yes, sir. He sat beside my wife's bed for the last 11 weeks of her life, I said, and my voice was doing something I didn't entirely have control over, a roughness moving through it, a vibration like a string pulled too tight. He held her hand when I couldn't be in the room anymore. He called me after she passed and said he was sorry. He said Margaret was one of the finest people he'd ever had the privilege of caring for. I stopped, breathed. And he filed a report saying I can't manage my own affairs. I'm sorry, Mr. Whitmore, Ryan said quietly. I know this is difficult to hear. Who paid him? I asked. We're still confirming the financial trail, but the report was submitted directly to an attorney associated with Daniel Marsh, not through any standard medical channel. That's irregular in a way that's going to be very difficult for Dr. Whitfield to explain. I set the cold coffee down on the windowsill and pressed the heel of my free hand against my sternum where the surgical scar ran in its long, careful line. The pain there was dull, now manageable. Nothing like the sharp grief that had just moved through me at the mention of Whitfield's name. Nora was out of bed now, standing beside me in her socks and her Atlanta Braves sweatshirt, reading my face with the focused intensity of someone who has known you long enough to translate your expressions without subtitles. Her own face was tightening by degrees, the jaw first, then the eyes, and when I mouthed Whitfield at her, she closed her eyes briefly like she'd taken a small blow. There's something else, Ryan said. I've been contacted by a Dr. Patricia Voss. She's the cardiologist who oversaw your bypass recovery at Sarasota Memorial. She reached out to Amelia's office this morning on her own initiative. I remember Dr. Voss, I said. A careful woman, precise. She had explained my surgery to me using a diagram she'd drawn on a notepad, and she'd answered every question I asked, without once making me feel foolish for asking it. She reviewed Whitfield's cognitive assessment, and she has significant concerns, Ryan said. Her words, not mine. She said the report lacks the standard battery of tests required for a legitimate post-operative cognitive evaluation. There's no neurological consultation documented, no formal screening tools cited, no baseline comparison. She said, and again I'm quoting, "This document would not pass peer review. It reads like something written to reach a predetermined conclusion." Something moved through me then that I can only describe as cold fury, not hot, not loud, just cold and very, very clear. The kind of anger that doesn't make you want to shout. The kind that makes you want to be extremely precise. What was the report going to be used for? I asked, though I already knew. Amelia believes Daniel intended to file for guardianship of your person and estate, Ryan said. With a medical document supporting cognitive decline, Emily could have petitioned the court to have you declared legally incapacitated. At that point, she would have had court-sanctioned control over every asset you own. Nora made a sound beside me, a short, sharp exhale that wasn't quite a word, but communicated something absolutely unprintable. They hadn't filed yet, I asked. No. The lis pendens. Amelia filed moved faster than they expected. We think they were still building the case when you came home. I turned away from the window and sat down heavily on the edge of the bed. Nora sat beside me immediately, close enough that our shoulders touched, and she reached over and took my hand, the way she had the night before with Margaret's letter, not saying anything, just present, just there, which was the most useful thing another person could do for me right now. I want to ask you something, Mr. Whitmore, Ryan said carefully. And you don't have to answer today. But I need to know, how much do you want to pursue this? Because what I'm looking at goes well beyond a property dispute. and a forged document. This has the shape of something considerably larger. I thought about Margaret's letter folded in my breast pocket, where I'd been carrying it since last night. Don't let them make you small. Tell me about the crates, I said. Tell me what you think is in them. Ryan took a breath. That, he said, is exactly what I want to talk to you about next. Ryan Cole arrived at Amelia's office 2 days later, with a folder so thick it required its own chair. I was not what I'd expected. I think I'd been picturing someone with the clipped military bearing of a federal agent from a television procedural pressed suit firm handshake, the kind of man who identifies himself by his last name only. Ryan was none of that. He was around 40 with a day's worth of stubble and the slightly rumpled look of someone who'd been awake since 4 in the morning, doing things that mattered more than ironing his shirt. He shook my hand and looked at me directly and said, "Mr. Whitmore, I've been doing this work for 16 years. What I'm about to show you is one of the cleaner cases I've seen in terms of documentation. That's the good news." "What's the bad news?" I asked. "The bad news," he said, pulling out a chair and opening the folder, "is that it's been going on for a long time." He spread the first set of documents across Amelia's conference table. At the top was a business registration, Marsh Logistics, LLC, filed in Delaware 3 years and 4 months ago. Delaware incorporation was common for shell companies. The state's disclosure requirements were minimal, and its filing fees were low. The registered agent was a law firm in Wilmington that Ryan explained made its business providing exactly that service to exactly that kind of company. "Marsh Logistics has no employees on record," Ryan said, moving through the documents with the practiced efficiency of a man who had presented evidence many times. "No physical office, no operating history that would survive 5 minutes of scrutiny. It exists on paper for one purpose: to generate shipping documentation that looks legitimate from a distance." He pulled out a second set of pages. Shipping manifests. Dates, weights, point of origin, destination. I scanned them and felt the floor tilt slightly beneath me. "These go back 3 years, I said. 3 years and 4 months, Ryan confirmed. "The first documented delivery to your property occurred 14 weeks after Marsh Logistics was incorporated." He paused, and I could see in his expression that he understood exactly what he was about to say, and had chosen his words accordingly. "Mr. Whitmore, at that point in time, your wife was still alive." The room went very quiet, except for the distant sound of traffic 12 floors below us. Amelia set her pen down. I pressed both hands flat on the table and kept my voice level through a concentrated effort that cost me considerably. "She was bedridden by then," I said. "She couldn't get downstairs." "I know," Ryan said quietly. "I'm sorry." "She was upstairs," I said, and I heard my own voice doing something I couldn't fully control, a tremor moving through it, like a crack working through old wood. "In the bedroom with the blue curtains, working very hard just to breathe. And he was running shipments through the basement." "Yes, sir," Ryan said. He didn't look away. He didn't offer anything hollow. He just held the weight of it with me for a moment, which was the right thing to do. I breathed in slowly, out slowly, let my heart find its rhythm. "Tell me what was in the crates," I said. Ryan pulled out a third set of documents, photographs, this time printed on standard paper. Artifacts. Sculptures, pottery, framed works, objects. I didn't have the expertise to identify precisely, but that carried the unmistakable gravity of things that were very old and very significant, and had no business being transported in unmarked wooden crates through a private wine cellar in Sarasota, Florida. "Cultural property," Ryan said. "Antiquities. Our preliminary assessment, based on partial identification from the footage Marcus provided, suggests multiple countries of origin, some pre-Columbian, some Mediterranean. At least 2 pieces we believe are on international watch lists. He tapped the photographs. These aren't reproductions. The real things move through channels like this because legitimate channels ask too many questions. Amelia leaned forward. What's the estimated value of what's currently in that basement? Ryan looked at her steadily. The final shipment Daniel is preparing, the one we believe he intends to move within the next few weeks, we estimate at approximately $40 million. Nora, who had been silent beside me for the past 10 minutes, made a sound that started as a word and didn't finish as one. I looked at the photographs spread across Amelia's conference table. Objects that belonged to history, to museums, to the countries they'd been taken from. Sitting in the basement of the house I'd built for Margaret, moved through the corridor she'd never been strong enough to visit, shipped out through the dock, where I used to watch the sunrise with a cup of coffee before the world got complicated. They didn't want my house, I said. It wasn't a question. I was working it out as I said it, the pieces assembling themselves into a shape I could finally see clearly. They wanted the location, the dock, the corridor, the private access. That's correct, Ryan said. There is no better positioned private property for this purpose on the Sarasota waterfront. Believe me, I've looked. I sat back in my chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment, and then I looked at Ryan Cole and I said, Ed, what do you need from me? He smiled for the first time, a small, tired, genuine smile. I need you to let me finish building the case, he said. And then I need you to let us do our jobs. Done, I said. What else? I need you to act completely normal around Emily and Daniel if you have any contact with them. He closed the folder. I need them to believe that nothing has changed. Can you do that? I thought about Daniel standing in my doorway with a glass of orange juice telling me I belonged in a care facility. I thought about Emily on the front steps with that folder pressed against her chest like a shield. Yes, I said. I've had practice. We went to the waterside on a Thursday afternoon, approaching the property from the marina 2 docks down, coming in by boat, the way you do when you don't want anyone in the main house to see you arriving. Ryan handled the small outboard like a man who had grown up around boats, which it turned out he had. He was from Beaufort, South Carolina, and had spent his childhood on the water before spending his career chasing the things that moved through it illegally. Amelia sat in the bow with her legal pad on her knee making notes, despite the chop. Marcus sat beside me in the stern, and he hadn't said much since we left the marina, but his jaw was set in a way that told me he was managing something considerable. I looked at my house from the water for the first time in 11 years. It was strange seeing it from this angle. The white stucco catching the afternoon light, the palm trees. Margaret had insisted on planted along the seawall, the blue of the pool visible over the low hedge. From out here, it looked exactly like what it was supposed to be. A beautiful home on the Sarasota waterfront. The kind of place you see in magazines and think someone lives an extraordinary life in there. Someone had. For a little while. And then she was gone. I pressed my hand flat against the gunnel and made myself focus. Ryan cut the engine as we drifted toward the private dock at the rear of the property. The dock was original to the house, old treated wood, well-maintained, designed for a boat I'd owned for 3 years and sold after Margaret got sick because I couldn't be away from the house for even an afternoon. There was a gate at the shore end, padlocked, and beside the gate, set into the seawall, was a steel access door that I had always known as the drainage corridor entrance. It was not, Ryan had explained, merely a drainage corridor anymore. He tied off the boat, and we stepped onto the dock, and he produced a key, one of Carlos Rivera's copies. It turned out, because the lock on the access door had been rekeyed along with everything else. The door opened with a sound of displaced air, cool and slightly damp, and Ryan clicked on a flashlight and led us inside. The corridor was 200 feet long. I knew that because I had commissioned it, the original drainage infrastructure, dated to the 1970s, and when I renovated the property, I had widened it for maintenance access, poured a concrete floor and run electrical conduit along the ceiling. It had seemed practical at the time, a sensible improvement. What I had not done was install the steel rail system that now ran the length of the floor, bolted into the concrete at 8-foot intervals. I had not installed the additional lighting LED strips along the lower walls wired to a separate breaker. I had not added the ventilation duct that hummed faintly overhead. Someone had done all of those things, carefully, incrementally, over a period of months. "How long did this take?" I asked, and my voice echoed slightly off the concrete walls. Ryan moved the flashlight along the rail system. "Our best estimate is 8 to 10 months of intermittent work," he said. "Done in sections by different crews paid in cash. No single contractor would have seen the whole picture." He crouched and ran his hand along one of the rails. "This is good work, Mr. Whitmore. Whoever designed this knew what they were doing." "Daniel has a background in logistics," Amelia said from behind us. "Before the failed businesses, he managed a freight operation in Tampa for 2 years. That explains the rail gauge," Ryan said. "Standard pallet width. These crates roll from the cellar to the dock without being lifted. One man could move a 200-pound crate in under 3 minutes." Marcus made a sound. Beside me, a short exhale through his nose that expressed something beyond the capacity of words. "He told me they were fixing a drainage issue," he said, and his voice was rough with the specific anger of a man who had been lied to professionally and taken it personally. "I saw the workers going in and out for weeks. Emily said it was routine maintenance. I believed her." He paused. "I should not have believed her." "You had no reason not to," I said. "I had 25 years of reasons," Marcus said quietly. "I knew that house better than I knew my own apartment. I should have known something was wrong." I put my hand on his shoulder briefly, just a moment, just enough. He straightened and cleared his throat and looked back at the rail system, and I understood that he needed to keep moving, the same way I did, that standing still with this particular grief was not something either of us could afford right now. We walked the full length of the corridor and came out through the cellar door into the wine room. The crates were still there exactly as I'd seen them in the footage, stacked, banded, stenciled. Ryan didn't touch them. He photographed them from multiple angles with a small camera narrating into a voice recorder as he moved. "Marcus," he said, without looking up from the viewfinder, "you mentioned Daniel asked you once how often the dock was inspected by the county." "Annual inspection," Marcus said. I told him that. He nodded like it was good news. Ryan lowered the camera and looked at me. "The last county inspection was 8 months ago," he said. "The next one is in 4 months. That's their window." He glanced at the crates. "The final shipment moves before that inspection. I'd bet my career on it." We came back out to the dock and stood in the late afternoon light, and I looked back at the house at the upstairs window of the bedroom, with the blue curtains, and felt something settle in me that had been moving around loose for weeks. Not anger, not grief. Something colder and more useful. "Ryan," I said, "what do you need to get a federal warrant?" He looked at me with an expression that was as close to satisfied as I'd seen him get. "I need the footage Marcus provided, the shipping manifests, the forensic document analysis on the POA, and your formal cooperation as the property owner." He paused. "I also need one more thing, and I think we're close to having it." "What's that?" "I need to know who's buying," he said. "And based on what Amelia and I reviewed this morning, I believe we already do." He looked at Amelia. She opened the second folder she'd been holding and placed a photograph on the table. "Victor Marsh," Ryan said. "I need to pause here for a second. What Ryan showed me next, I genuinely was not prepared for it. Before I tell you who the man behind this really was, leave a still here in the comments. I want to know you're with me before we go any further. A quick note. Some details in this story have been shaped for narrative and educational purposes. If you prefer stories presented differently, this is a good place to stop, no judgment at all. Victor Marsh. I had not heard that name in close to 20 years, and hearing it now in Amelia's conference room, spoken quietly, almost carefully, the way you say a name that carries weight, produced a physical sensation I wasn't prepared for. A kind of dropping somewhere behind my sternum, like a floor giving way 1 inch at a time. Ryan spread a second folder on the table. Victor Marsh, age 68. A photograph clipped to the inside cover showed a heavy-set man with silver hair and the carefully maintained appearance of someone who understood that looking prosperous was itself a form of currency. He was smiling in the photograph. He had good teeth. He had always had good teeth. "You know him," Ryan said. It wasn't a question. 25 years ago. I said Victor Marsh was my business partner's brother-in-law. He had a small freight brokerage in Tampa that was 6 weeks from insolvency. I looked at the photograph and felt something move through me that I could only describe as the specific exhaustion of a man confronting the full ledger of his own naivety. I guaranteed a loan, $2 million. He paid it back over 4 years, and I considered the matter closed and the man trustworthy. Amelia set her pen down slowly. "That's why you approved the marriage." "Daniel came to me 3 years later," I said. "Victor's son, charming young man. Emily was 30, she was happy, and I thought I knew the family." I paused. I thought I knew the family. Ryan turned a page in the folder. Victor Marsh dissolved the freight brokerage 8 years ago and has been operating in what we'd describe as the gray market for cultural property ever since. He identifies buyers, primarily private collectors in Western Europe and Southeast Asia, for artifacts that cannot be sold through legitimate auction houses because their provenance is either unknown or actively disputed. He slid a page toward me. His wife, Elaine, has a background in art history and document authentication. She produces certificates of provenance, false ones. Good enough to pass casual scrutiny, not good enough to survive expert analysis. "A family business," Amelia said, and her voice was flat with a particular kind of professional disgust. "3 generations of it, potentially," Ryan said. "We're still untangling the edges." He looked at me steadily. "Mr. Whitmore, I need to explain something about the FBI's position before we go any further, because I want you to understand why your cooperation is not just helpful. It is in a legal sense what makes this case possible." I nodded. "Federal agents have been aware of Victor Marsh for approximately 18 months, Ryan said. "They have been building a case against his network through financial analysis and international coordination with Interpol. But their ability to act has been constrained by one significant problem." He paused. "Your villa. Every piece of evidence that would support a federal search warrant is located inside a private residence. Without the property owner's consent or an independent probable cause that doesn't rely on entering the property, the FBI cannot get inside that house legally. Everything obtained without proper authorization would be inadmissible, and it would potentially poison the entire prosecution." He folded his hands on the table. "You are the property owner. The forged POA has been challenged and is under active litigation. Your ownership is not in serious dispute. When you say to the FBI, 'I am the legal owner of this property, and I am inviting your investigation,' you give them something they have not had for 18 months. He looked at me with the direct, undecorated gaze of a man who needed me to understand the full significance of what he was saying. "You open the door." I sat with that for a moment. Outside the window, the bay was going copper in the late afternoon light. "The final shipment," I said. "You said it moves in the next few weeks." "Daniel is moving faster than we expected," Ryan said. "We believe the pressure from the Lis pendants and the POA litigation has accelerated his timeline. He wants the last shipment out before the legal situation becomes too unpredictable." He turned another page. "We've also identified a specific trigger event. Victor and Elaine have listed their home in Port Charlotte for sale. Once that sale closes, they have no reason to remain in Florida except to take possession of a property they believe is being handed to them." Something cold settled in my chest. "They think they're moving in," I said. "They've already begun packing," Ryan confirmed. I looked at the photograph of Victor Marsh with his good teeth and his prosperous smile, and I thought about the afternoon. I'd signed that guarantee sitting at a conference table, not unlike this one, thinking I was doing something decent for a man who needed help. 25 years ago. Victor had shaken my hand and looked me in the eye and thanked me with what had seemed like genuine emotion. Maybe it had been genuine. Maybe 25 years was simply long enough for gratitude to metabolize completely into something else. "What do you need me to sign?" I asked. Ryan allowed himself a small smile. "Amelia has the documentation ready," he said. "Once you sign, I take it to the FBI Tampa field office today. We'll have a federal warrant within 72 hours. Amelia slid a document across the table. I read it carefully, all of it, every clause, the way I'd learned to read documents after a lifetime of signing ones that mattered. Then I picked up the pen. My hand was completely steady. "One condition," I said before I signed. "There's a specific position I need filled on the day this happens. Not by an agent, by someone else." Ryan raised an eyebrow. "Who?" "Marcus Hill," I said. "He goes in through the tunnel. He's at the dock end when Daniel runs." I looked up. "I need him to be the one standing there." Ryan studied me for a moment. I could see him working through the logistics, the optics, the liability considerations. Then he said, "He'd be with agents. He wouldn't act alone." "I know," I said. "I just need him there." Ryan nodded slowly. "I'll make it work." I signed the document, slid it back across the table, and felt for the first time since I'd stepped out of that taxi and seen my suitcase on the sidewalk that the ground beneath me was solid. Amelia received 2 phone calls on the same Tuesday morning, 40 minutes apart. The first was from a young woman named Sophie Callahan. The second was from a man named Carlos Rivera. They did not know each other. They had never spoken. They had arrived at the same decision by entirely different roads, and the fact that they both used almost the same words, "I should have said something sooner," struck me when Amelia told me about it, as one of those small, accidental symmetries that you don't plan for and can't manufacture. I was in Amelia's conference room when they came in, sitting in the same chair I'd occupied for most of the past 3 weeks, with a cup of coffee that had gone cold beside me and Nora reading the newspaper across the table, because she had decided without being asked that she was staying in Sarasota until this was finished. She had rescheduled 2 months of her life without complaint or commentary, and I had not yet found adequate words for what that meant to me, so I hadn't tried. Sophie Callahan arrived first. She was 29, with the careful posture of someone who had spent years navigating hospital corridors quietly, and she was visibly nervous in the way of a person who has done something brave and is now fully aware of it. She sat across from Amelia with her hands wrapped around a paper coffee cup, and she said before Amelia could ask her anything at all, "I want to be clear that I'm here on my own. Nobody asked me to come. I read about the lawsuit in the paper, and I knew I had to say something." Amelia nodded. "Take your time, Ms. Callahan." Sophie took a breath that trembled slightly at the edges. I was on shift the day before Mr. Whitmore's discharge, she said. Evening rotation 6 to midnight. I was charting outside room 214, his room, and the door was partially open, maybe 6 inches. She looked at me directly for the first time, and her eyes were bright with something that was equal parts distress and determination. His daughter and her husband were inside. I wasn't trying to listen. I heard them. What did you hear? Amelia asked. Sophie set her coffee cup down and pressed her palms flat on the table, a gesture so similar to one I'd made myself in this same room that it startled me. The husband said once the old man signs everything moves forward, and she, the daughter, said he'll sign. He always does what I ask. Sophie's voice cracked slightly on the last sentence and she cleared her throat hard. I wrote it down when I got home that night. The exact words, the time, the date, the name of the nurse who was on the station with me. She slid a folded piece of paper across the table. I've had it in my kitchen drawer for 3 weeks, and I couldn't sleep, and I'm sorry it took me this long. Amelia took the paper, read it, and said, Ms. Callahan, you have nothing to apologize for. Would you be willing to provide a formal, sworn statement? Sophie nodded so quickly it was almost a flinch. Yes, absolutely yes. That's why I came. I looked at this young woman across the table. 29 years old, someone's nurse, someone's daughter, someone who had gone home after a 12-hour shift and written down what she'd heard because something in her had known. It mattered and felt my throat tighten in a way I'd been doing my best to manage for weeks. Thank you, I said. My voice came out rough. I mean that. Sophie looked at me and her eyes filled just slightly, though she held it together with the practiced composure of someone who spent her working life managing her emotions in rooms where emotion was dangerous. I hope it helps, she said. I really do. Carlos Rivera arrived 40 minutes later, and he was exactly what he'd sounded like on the phone, a practical man, mid-40s, with the calloused hands of someone who worked for a living, and the direct gaze of someone who had decided something and was not going to be talked out of it. He sat down, declined coffee, and said, I figure you know why I'm here. Tell us in your own words, Amelia said. Carlos leaned forward slightly. The woman Emily, the daughter, she hired my company to rekey the property. Full job. Gate, front entry, rear entry, the guest entrance on the side. He spread his hands. I've rekeyed hundreds of properties. Divorce situations, estate disputes. Sometimes just people who lose their keys. I can tell the difference. He looked at me steadily. I pulled the property file when I got the work order. Your name was on it, Mr. Whitmore. Original owner going back to the first service call we did out there 11 years ago. And the woman calling to change all the locks wasn't you. What did you do? Amelia asked. I did the job, Carlos said plainly. I needed the work and I wasn't certain enough to refuse. But I made an extra set before I handed over the new keys. He reached into his jacket pocket and produced a small envelope identical to the one Amelia had shown me weeks ago. I mailed the first set to your P.O. box. I kept these as a backup. He set the envelope on the table. And I wrote up a statement the same day documenting exactly what the work order said, who called it in, and what I did. Had my office manager witness it. He paused. I'm a locksmith, not a lawyer, but I know when something isn't right. Nora made a sound from across the table, a low, involuntary exhale that she immediately tried to cover by turning a page in her newspaper, and failed because her newspaper was shaking slightly. After Carlos left, Amelia gathered the statements and aligned them neatly on the desk. Sophie Callahan's handwritten notes, Carlos Rivera's witnessed documentation, Dr. Voss's medical assessment, the forensic analysis of the forged POA which had come back that morning, confirming chemical alteration of the original document, Ryan's shipping manifests, Marcus's footage. She looked up at me. "The evidentiary record is complete," she said. "Every element has independent corroboration. This is not a case that will fall apart under cross-examination." I nodded. From across the table, Nora folded her newspaper deliberately and set it down, and looked at me with eyes that were wet at the corners, but steady, and she said, "Harold, it's almost over." My chest ached in a way that had nothing to do with the surgery. "Not yet," I said, "but close." That night, at 2 in the morning, my phone lit up on the nightstand. I looked at the name on the screen for a long time. Emily. The phone felt heavier than it should have when I picked it up. Not because I was deciding whether to answer. I'd already decided that the moment I saw it, something in me went very still and very alert, the way it does when you're about to hear something you can't unhear. I was looking at her name because I was trying to remember the last time she'd called me without wanting something. I couldn't get there. The memory wouldn't surface. I answered on the 4th ring. "Emily." Silence for 2 seconds. Then she started crying. Not the controlled, purposeful tears I'd seen from her at Margaret's funeral. The kind that are real but also performed, that acknowledge grief while keeping it at arm's length. This was different. This was the sound of someone who had been holding something enormous for too long and had finally lost their grip on it entirely. She was crying the way people cry at 2 in the morning, when there's no audience and no reason to manage it anymore, in ragged, ugly, honest waves that she couldn't seem to catch her breath between. "Dad," she said, and her voice broke completely on the word, split right down the middle. "Dad, I need you to know something." My chest tightened so hard it hurt. I pressed my free hand flat against the mattress and kept my voice level. "I'm listening, Emily." "I didn't know," she said, and the words came out fractured, pushed through tears. "About the things in the basement. About what he was moving through there. I swear to you, Dad. I thought it was just the house. I thought it was just about the property. And I know that was wrong, I know that. But I didn't know about the rest of it. I didn't know what he was using it for." She was crying so hard, now she was hiccuping between sentences, a sound so raw, it did something uncomfortable to the place behind my ribs, where I'd been keeping everything carefully contained. "2 weeks ago," she said. "I went down to the wine cellar to look for something, and one of the crates was open, just sitting open, and inside there was—" She stopped, pulled in a breath that shook all the way through her. It was a sculpture. Old. Really old. And there was a tag on it with numbers, and I looked it up, and it was on a list, an Interpol list. Dad, it was on a list of stolen cultural property. She let out a sound then that I can only describe as someone discovering all at once the full weight of a thing they've been standing next to without realizing. Not just crying now, something deeper than crying, something that had been building for longer than 2 weeks, maybe longer than she knew. "I didn't know what to do," she said, her voice dropping to something barely above a whisper. "I was scared. I am scared. And I know I don't have the right to call you, and I know I don't have the right to ask you for anything, but I needed you to know that I didn't, that I never meant for it to go this far." I sat in the dark hotel room with the phone against my ear, and I let her finish. I let her get all the way to the end of it. Because whatever else was true, whatever came next in the legal proceedings and the federal warrants, and the cases that were already being built in offices, I would never see she was still my daughter, and she was 2,300 miles away from the person she'd been when she was small, and I was the one who had answered the phone at 2 in the morning. When she went quiet, I said, "Emily, I need to ask you one question." She made a sound that meant she was listening. Do you want to do the right thing? The silence that followed was the longest of my life. I counted it without meaning to 1 second, 5, 10, 15. I could hear her breathing on the other end, unsteady and effortful, the breathing of someone standing at the edge of something and looking down. 20 seconds. Then the line went dead. I held the phone in my hand and looked at the dark ceiling and felt not rage, not grief, not satisfaction. Something more complicated than any of those. The particular sorrow of a man who has asked his child a simple question and received silence as the answer, and who understands that the silence is itself an answer, just not the one he was hoping for. I set the phone on the nightstand next to Margaret's music box. I did not call Amelia. I did not wake Nora. I lay back on the hotel bed in the dark and stared at the ceiling until the first gray light began to show at the edges of the curtains. At 6:15, my phone rang again. Ryan Cole. "She called you last night," he said. Not a question. "How did you know?" I asked. "Because Daniel found out this morning," Ryan said, "and he is moving the timeline up. The shipment goes in 8 days. A pause. "And Mr. Whitmore, he's not planning to take Emily with him when it does. I was at Amelia's office by 7:30. Ryan was already there when I arrived, sitting at the conference table with his jacket off and his sleeves rolled to the elbows, which told me he'd been there for a while. There was a paper cup from the coffee place downstairs in front of him, and a second one waiting at my usual chair, still steaming. He'd remembered how I took it black, no sugar, without being told twice, which was the kind of detail that told you something about a man. Amelia came in 2 minutes behind me, immaculate as always, as though she had not also received an early morning phone call and rearranged her entire day around it. She set her bag down, looked at both of us and said, "Tell me everything in order, starting with last night." Ryan went first. "Daniel Marsh discovered the call between Emily and her father sometime before 6 this morning," he said. "We don't know exactly how possibly he monitors her phone. Possibly," she told him. "Possibly he simply noticed the call log. What we know is that his response was immediate. He turned his laptop so we could see the screen. Financial records, transaction logs, numbers moving across a table in columns. At 5:47 this morning, Neil initiated a series of wire transfers totaling approximately $3.2 million from accounts held under Marsh Logistics to an account in the Cayman Islands registered to a holding company we've been tracking for 6 months." Amelia leaned forward and looked at the screen. Her jaw tightened by a single degree, the only sign she gave that this was anything other than a routine Tuesday. "He's liquidating," she said. "He's preparing an exit," Ryan confirmed. "The wire transfers are the first stage. The second stage is the shipment moving the remaining inventory out of the property before anyone can seize it. And the third stage—" He paused and looked at me directly. "We found a one-way flight booking this morning. Business class Miami to Zurich, departing 9 days from now. 1 passenger." "Not Emily," I said. "Not Emily," Ryan said. "Not Victor or Elaine either, just Daniel." I sat with that for a moment. I thought about Emily on the phone at 2 in the morning, crying in a way I hadn't heard from her since she was a child, since the night Margaret had taken her to the emergency room for a broken wrist, and she'd called me from the waiting room 7 years old and terrified. I thought about the fact that the man she had trusted with her life, the man she had helped lock her own father out of his home, was currently booking a solo flight to Zurich and moving $3 million to the Cayman Islands without telling her. "She doesn't know," I said. "Almost certainly not," Ryan said. "Daniel Marsh has been running this operation for 3 years with a very clear division of knowledge. Emily knew enough to be useful. She didn't know enough to be dangerous. He closed the laptop. Now that she's become dangerous, he's cutting his losses. Amelia straightened in her chair. What does this do to our timeline? It compresses it, Ryan said. We had been planning for a date approximately 2 weeks out. That's no longer viable. The FBI is requesting we move to 8 days, which means the warrant needs to be finalized today. The operational plan needs to be set by tomorrow, and everything needs to be in place by the end of this week. He looked at me. I need to know if you're ready to move that fast. I thought about Margaret's letter in my breast pocket. I thought about the 17 folders on Marcus's hard drive, 17 nights of men carrying crates through the corridor, 2 floors below the room where my wife was dying. I thought about Victor Marsh's photograph, those good teeth, that prosperous smile, and the afternoon I'd signed a guarantee for him at a conference table 25 years ago, thinking I was doing something decent. I've been ready, I said, since the day I saw the suitcase on the sidewalk. Ryan nodded. He opened a new folder and began walking us through the operational details, the FBI team composition, the coordination with Sarasota PD, the civil standby procedures, the documentation Amelia needed to have on hand. I listened carefully and asked questions where I had them, and tried not to think about the fact that in 8 days I would walk back into my own home for the first time since I'd been turned away at the gate. When Ryan finished, Amelia gathered her notes and looked at me over the top of her glasses. Is there anything you need before we begin the final preparations? I thought about it. One thing, I said. I want to make sure Marcus knows his position before the morning. Not from Ryan's team. From me. Of course, she said. And one more thing. I looked at Ryan. Emily. Whatever she decides to do between now and then, whether she cooperates fully, whether she doesn't, I don't want anyone making promises to her on my behalf. That's not my role, and it's not something I'm willing to do. Ryan studied me. Understood. But I also don't want her blindsided the way her in-laws are going to be blindsided, I said. She had her chance. She made her choice when she hung up the phone. But she's still... I stopped, pressed my lips together, tried again. She is still my daughter, and whatever the law decides to do with that, I would prefer she have a lawyer present when it does. Ryan looked at Amelia. Amelia looked at me. I'll make a call, she said quietly. I nodded and stood up and put on my jacket, and the 3 of us went to work. Amelia's assistant knocked on the conference room door on a Wednesday afternoon and said that a Dr. James Whitfield was in the lobby asking to see her. No appointment. No attorney with him. Just a man who had called ahead by 20 minutes and said he needed to speak with someone about Harold Whitmore. Amelia looked at me across the table. I looked back at her. Send him up, I said. He came through the door looking like a man who had not slept in several days and had made only a partial effort to conceal it. James Whitfield was 61, with the careful professional appearance of a physician who understood that patients needed to trust him on sight. The pressed shirt, the good watch, the hair combed with intention. But his eyes were red at the rims, and his hands, when he set his briefcase on the table, were trembling, in a way he couldn't fully control, the fine motor tremor of someone running on anxiety and very little else. He saw me and stopped. I don't know what he expected. Perhaps he thought I would stand up or raise my voice or do something that would let him organize his guilt around my anger. I didn't give him that. I stayed in my chair and I looked at him steadily, and I waited because I had learned over the past several weeks that waiting was one of the most powerful things a man could do. Whitfield sat down across from me. He pressed both palms flat on the table. I had seen so many people do that in this room that it had begun to feel like a gesture specific to the act of telling the truth. and he drew a breath that shook all the way in and all the way out. "I don't know where to start," he said. "Start at the beginning," Amelia said. Her voice was not unkind, but it was precise. "And don't leave anything out." Whitfield nodded. He kept his eyes on the table at first, as though direct eye contact with either of us was a thing he needed to work up to. "Daniel Marsh contacted me 14 weeks ago," he said. "He told me he was concerned about Mr. Whitmore's cognitive state following the surgery. He said the family was worried. He said—" Whitfield stopped and cleared his throat, and I could see the muscles in his jaw working. "He said it would be a kindness to document what he was observing, to give the family the legal tools to protect a man who might not be able to protect himself." "And you believed him," Amelia said. Whitfield's mouth tightened. "I wanted to believe him," he said, with a precision that told me he'd spent considerable time arriving at that particular distinction. "There's a difference. He was persuasive and I was—" He stopped again. His hands pressed harder against the table. "I was in debt. Significant personal debt. A malpractice settlement from 3 years ago that my insurance didn't fully cover. Daniel knew about it. I don't know how, but he knew." His voice dropped. "He offered me $80,000. I told myself I was doing a clinical assessment based on observable concerns. I told myself that for about 4 days, and then I stopped sleeping." I looked at this man across Amelia's conference table. 61 years old. A physician. He had sat beside Margaret's bed in her final weeks, and held her hand, and spoken to her gently, and called me afterward to say she had gone peacefully, that she had not been in pain at the end, that he was sorry for my loss. I had thanked him. I had meant it. My chest ached with something that was not quite anger and not quite grief, but sat precisely at the intersection of the two, pressing against my sternum from the inside. "James," I said, and my voice came out quieter than I intended, scraped thin by everything I was keeping below the surface. "You were in that room with her, in those last weeks. You were the one who adjusted her medication when the pain broke through. You were there on a Tuesday night in October when I couldn't make myself go in." I stopped, swallowed, started again. "And then you signed a document saying I couldn't manage my own mind." Whitfield looked up at me, then finally fully, and the expression on his face was one of the most wretched things I have ever seen on a human being. His eyes were wet and his jaw was trembling, and he looked like a man being asked to stand inside the full consequence of something he'd done, and finding the space considerably smaller than he could bear. "I am sorry," he said, and his voice broke completely on the last word, cracked open like something under too much pressure. "I am so deeply sorry, Harold. I have been sorry every single day since I signed it, and I don't expect that to mean anything to you, and I'm not here because I think it will. I'm here because it's the only thing left I can do that isn't wrong." The room was very quiet for a moment, except for the sound of traffic far below and Whitfield's unsteady breathing. Amelia set a document on the table in front of him. A sworn affidavit already drafted covering everything he'd just said and the spaces between it. "Read it carefully," she said. "Every word. If anything is inaccurate or incomplete, tell me now." Whitfield picked it up with hands that were still shaking and read it with the slow, thorough attention of a man who understood that this was the most important document he would ever put his name to. He read it twice. Then he set it down, picked up Amelia's pen, and signed it in a hand that steadied just barely at the last moment. When he stood to leave, I stood as well. He looked at me across the table, and I could see him trying to find something to say that would be adequate and failing because there wasn't anything. "Take care of yourself, James," I said finally. It was not forgiveness. It was not absolution. It was simply what you say to a man who is going to have to live with something for a very long time, because saying nothing at all seemed like its own particular cruelty. He nodded once, picked up his briefcase, and walked out. After the door closed, Amelia picked up the signed affidavit and added it to the folder. Then she looked at me over the top of her glasses, with the careful, assessing expression she used when she was deciding how much to say. 3 days, she said quietly. I reached into my breast pocket and touched the edge of Margaret's letter. 3 days, I said. The night before, the three of us sat in my hotel room and didn't talk about what was happening in the morning. That was a mutual and unspoken agreement, not silence, but a deliberate choosing of other things. Nora had driven to a grocery store 2 miles away and come back with the components of a real meal, which she assembled in the small kitchenette with the focused energy of a woman who processes difficulty through usefulness. She made pasta and a salad and heated bread in the oven, and the smell of it filled the room in a way that made my chest ache with a sweetness I hadn't expected, because it smelled like a kitchen, like a home, like the particular domestic warmth of people who love each other, occupying the same space. Marcus arrived at 6 with a bottle of good wine and the careful posture of a man attending something important. He was wearing a jacket I hadn't seen before, dark navy, well-fitted, and when Nora saw it, she said, "Marcus, you look wonderful," with the directness that was entirely her own, and Marcus straightened even further and said, "Thank you, Ms. Nora," with a formality that made her laugh, and the laugh broke something loose in the room that had needed breaking. We ate at the small table by the window. The sun went down over the bay while we were on the salad course, and the water turned the color of old copper, and nobody pointed it out, because we were all looking at it, and it didn't need words. Nora was the one who started talking about Margaret. Not the illness, not the end, the earlier version, the Margaret, who had taught second grade for 11 years, before my company grew large enough that she didn't need to, and who had missed it every single day afterward, and volunteered at the school library on Thursdays for the rest of her life. She used to read to the kids in different voices, Nora said, twirling pasta around her fork with great concentration. Every character had a different voice. I went once and watched from the back of the room, and she had 17 8-year-olds absolutely riveted by a story about a dog who wanted to be a chef. She shook her head with the particular fondness of someone describing a person they can no longer call on the phone. She was ridiculous, in the best possible way. Marcus said, "She used to hum when she arranged flowers. I don't think she knew she was doing it. Monday mornings she would come into the kitchen and hum the entire time she was working on the arrangement for the front table, and then stop the moment she was finished, like the music was just for the flowers." My throat tightened so hard it hurt. I picked up my wine glass and held it with both hands and breathed through it. "She told me once," I said when I could, "that the happiest she ever felt in that house was Thursday mornings. Before the school run started, before the phone calls, before the day got moving. She said there was a half hour between 6:30 and 7 when the light came through the kitchen window at exactly the right angle, and the coffee was ready and the house was quiet, and she felt like everything was exactly where it was supposed to be." Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Marcus nodded slowly, and his eyes were bright in a way I had never seen in 25 years, and he said, "I know that light. I used to try not to disturb her during it." Nora reached across the table and put her hand over mine, and I let her, and we sat like that for a moment, while the copper water outside went slowly dark. After dinner, Marcus helped Nora clear the table while I sat on the edge of the bed and took Margaret's letter out of my breast pocket. I had read it so many times in the past several weeks that I had it memorized, every word, every pause the particular way she had written Harold at the top, with the small flourish on the H that she had never changed. But I read it again anyway, because some things are worth reading even when you know them by heart. When I finished, I folded it carefully and held it for a moment, and then I said, "I want to read it to you both." Nora came and sat beside me on the bed. Marcus pulled the chair from the desk and positioned it close, and I read it to them, all of it, from Harold at the top to M at the bottom, in a voice that held together better than I expected, mostly, except for the last two lines where it didn't. When I finished, Nora was crying openly, the way she'd stopped trying not to cry, sometime around day 3 of being in Sarasota. Marcus was looking at his hands in his lap, with the expression of a man feeling something large in a small space. His jaw set hard, his eyes very bright. She was right, Nora said, her voice wrecked and warm at the same time. About all of it. She usually was, I said. I reached over to the nightstand and picked up the music box. I wound it slowly, feeling the resistance of the spring tightening under my fingers, and then I lifted the lid. The melody rose into the room, thin and clear, and utterly itself the song Margaret had loved since before I knew her name. Nora pressed both hands over her mouth. Marcus closed his eyes and tilted his head back slightly, and I watched his throat move as he swallowed something down. We sat like that until the music ran out. Then Marcus looked at his watch and stood up and put on his jacket and said, "I should get some rest. Tomorrow is a significant day." He paused at the door and turned back, and he looked at me with the direct, uncomplicated gaze of a man who has decided something and is at peace with it. "It has been the privilege of my professional life, Mr. Whitmore," he said. "Whatever happens tomorrow, I want you to know that." My eyes burned. I stood up and crossed the room and shook his hand and held it a moment longer than a handshake requires, and Marcus let me. And that was enough. After he left, Nora changed into her pajamas and climbed into the other bed and turned off her lamp and said from the dark, "Harold, go to sleep." "I'm trying, Sound," I said. "Try harder," she said. "You need to be sharp tomorrow." "I know." "And Harold?" "Yes." A pause, warm and quiet. "She'd be so proud of you," Nora said softly. "She really would." I lay in the dark with the music box on the nightstand and my hand resting over the letter in my pocket, and felt the truth of that move through me like something finally coming to rest. At 5 in the morning, I put on my jacket and walked to the door. Marcus was already standing in the hallway, navy jacket, pressed posture, perfect 2 cups of coffee from the lobby in his hands. He held one out to me without a word. I took it, and we left. Everything I had done for the past 7 weeks, every document, every conversation, every night. I lay awake in that hotel room. It all came down to one morning. Before I take you inside that house with me, leave a 7 below. 7 weeks, and it all ends in a single hour. Quick note. Before we continue, this story contains some fictional elements added for storytelling and educational purposes. Details may have been adjusted for narrative flow. If you'd prefer to step away here, that's completely okay. Go well. We arrived at the villa at 5:15 in the morning, and the FBI was already there. Not visibly, that was the point. The 2 vehicles parked on the service road behind the property were unmarked, and the agents who had been inside since 4:30 were positioned in rooms where they wouldn't be seen from the main entrance. Ryan had walked me through the deployment plan the previous afternoon with the methodical patience of a man who understood that civilians needed to know enough to stay out of the way and not so much that they'd try to help. 4 agents inside, 2 in the grounds behind the property, a Sarasota PD unit, 2 blocks over available for backup if needed. And at the end of the tunnel, in the dark of the drainage corridor, beside the private dock, Marcus Hill, with 2 federal agents standing 6 feet behind him, Amelia met us at the front gate. She was wearing a charcoal suit and carrying her briefcase with the squared-off efficiency of someone arriving for the most important meeting of the year, which it was. She looked at me and said, "How are you feeling?" "Ask me in 3 hours," I said. She almost smiled. "Fair enough. Let's go in." The front door was unlocked. The agents had used Carlos Rivera's key set, which struck me as having a certain rightness to it. And when I stepped across the threshold of my own home for the first time in nearly 6 weeks, I stopped for a moment and just stood there. It was the smell, mostly. 11 years of a life lived in a particular place produces a scent that belongs to nowhere else. The specific combination of old wood and sea air, and the same cleaning products that had kept this house for 11 years, and the ghost of Margaret's perfume that I knew perfectly well was not actually there anymore, and that I kept catching anyway, the way you hear a song in a crowd and can't locate the source. The house smelled like my house. Whatever they had done to it in 6 weeks, they had not managed to change that. My throat tightened. I breathed through it and kept moving. The inside was different. Not dramatically, they hadn't gutted it or renovated it. There hadn't been time, but different in the way a room is different when it has been occupied by people who don't love it. The art on the walls was not Margaret's art. The arrangement of furniture in the living room had been adjusted by about 4 feet in a direction that made no structural sense, but probably made someone more comfortable. A large mirror had appeared in the front hallway where there had been nothing before, and it made the space look like a hotel lobby. I did not spend time on any of this. There would be time for all of that later, or there wouldn't, but either way, it was not the task of this morning. Ryan briefed me in the kitchen quietly, standing close, speaking in a voice calibrated to carry no further than the 2 of us. "The warrant covers the wine cellar and the drainage corridor in full," he said. "The moment the subjects are on the property, we move. You don't need to say anything. You don't need to do anything except be present." He looked at me steadily. "Amelia will handle the legal notifications. My team handles everything else. Your job this morning is to sit in that chair and let it happen." He pointed to the armchair by the front window, the one I had sat in on Sunday afternoons for 11 years, the one with the slight depression in the left cushion that had taken the shape of me over time. I sat down in it, and the fit of it was so familiar, so precisely the chair I had always sat in, that something in me that had been braced for weeks released all at once and left me feeling unexpectedly fragile for a moment before I steadied. I pressed my hand to my breast pocket. Margaret's letter. Still there. Always there. At 7:40, Ryan appeared in the doorway of the kitchen and held up 2 fingers. 2 minutes. I straightened in the chair, breathed in slowly, out slowly. At 7:42, I heard the crunch of tires on the front drive. Then voices, Victor's voice carrying the particular loudness of a man who has never had reason to moderate his volume in a space he believed was his. Elaine's laugh, higher than I remembered. The sound of car doors. 3 moving trucks came up the drive in a line, their diesel engines settling into idle. Ryan had briefed me on this the day before. The trucks served 2 purposes. On the surface, they carried Victor and Elaine's furniture and belongings. But the real plan, the one Daniel had arranged weeks earlier, was to use the noise and activity of a moving day as cover to load the crates from the wine cellar onto the dock and out through the waterway. A chaotic moving morning was the perfect distraction. Nobody questions a truck at a house that's being moved into. I watched through the front window as Victor Marsh stepped out of the lead vehicle and looked up at the face of my house with an expression of open, unguarded satisfaction. the look of a man arriving somewhere he has been anticipating for a very long time. I was wearing a linen shirt and khaki trousers, and he looked exactly like his photograph. Good and prosperous smile and all. And for one moment, just one, I felt the full weight of 25 years collapse into the space between us, the loan I had signed. The handshake, the afternoon, I had thought I was doing something decent for a man who needed help. Then the front door swung wide open, because the agents had released the latch from inside, and Victor Marsh walked into my house. Elaine came in behind him, already talking about which bedroom faced east. Two men from the moving company followed, carrying the first of what I assumed were many boxes. Then Emily stepped through the door. She was wearing sunglasses, despite the early hour, which told me she had been crying recently and had made a decision about who would see that. She had a coffee cup in one hand and her keys in the other, and she walked in talking to someone on her phone mid-sentence, the way you do when you're arriving somewhere comfortable and familiar. She lowered the phone. She saw the agents. She saw Amelia standing beside the dining room door with her briefcase open. She saw Ryan in the kitchen doorway with his jacket pushed back on one side in the way that showed his credentials. And then she turned her head and she saw me. I was sitting in my chair by the window, the chair that had always been my chair, the chair with the depression in the left cushion that had taken 11 years to get exactly right. Emily's face did something I had never seen it do before. Not anger, not calculation, not the careful management of expression she had practiced in front of me for years. It simply collapsed. Every layer of it all at once, like a structure whose load-bearing walls had just been removed simultaneously. Her coffee cup tilted in her hand, and she grabbed it with both hands to keep from dropping it, and her sunglasses slipped down her nose and she didn't push them up. "Dad," she said, and her voice came out as barely a whisper cracked open at both ends. I looked at my daughter across the front hall of my house, and then from somewhere behind her, Daniel Marsh came through the front door. Daniel Marsh was a man who processed information quickly. I had understood that about him for years. It was part of what made him effective, and part of what made him dangerous. He walked through the front door mid-stride, already talking something about the moving schedule and which crew was handling the upstairs, and he got approximately 4 words into the sentence before his brain caught up with what his eyes were showing him. He stopped. The sentence died in his throat. I watched him take in the room, in the systematic, rapid way of someone running a threat assessment. The agents positioned near the dining room, Chance in the kitchen doorway, Amelia standing with her briefcase open and a document in her hand. Victor and Elaine frozen near the foot of the stairs with expressions that hadn't caught up with events yet. Emily standing in the middle of the front hall with her sunglasses halfway down her nose and her coffee cup gripped in both hands like something to hold on to. And me, in the armchair by the window, in the chair that had always been my chair. Daniel's eyes moved to me last. And what crossed his face in that moment was not fear and not anger. It was the particular expression of a man who has run a very complicated calculation and arrived at an answer he doesn't like, a cold, rapid recalibration, the look of someone shifting from one plan to the next in real time. He turned and ran. Not toward the door he'd come in through. He was too smart for that, too many people between him and the exit. He went left down the hallway toward the kitchen, toward the basement stairs, moving with the focused, purposeful speed of a man who had rehearsed this exact route. His footsteps hammered down the hallway, hit the basement door, and then there was the sound of the door swinging open and his footsteps dropping into the stairwell, and then nothing. Victor Marsh said, "What in the—" Amelia stepped forward. "My name is Amelia Grant," she said, in the carrying, clear voice she used when she needed a room to understand something immediately. "I am counsel for Harold Whitmore, the legal owner of this property. I have here a federal warrant for the search of these premises and arrest warrants for Daniel Marsh, Victor Marsh, and Elaine Marsh issued by a federal judge this past Monday. She held up the documents. I also have a Sarasota County Sheriff's civil standby on the property. I would ask everyone to remain where they are. Victor's face went through several colors in rapid succession, red, then white, then a gray that alarmed me slightly from a medical standpoint. Elaine grabbed his arm with both hands and made a sound that started as a word and didn't finish as one, a sound of pure, unprocessed shock that bounced off the marble floors and the high ceilings of the front hall. "This is," Victor started. "Sir," one of the agents said, stepping forward, "I need you to stay where you are." Emily hadn't moved. She was standing exactly where she'd been standing when she said my name in the middle of the front hall, coffee cup in both hands. Sunglasses crooked on her face. But something had changed in her expression in the 30 seconds since Daniel had run. The collapse I'd seen when she first saw me had deepened into something else, something quieter and more terrible. The expression of a woman doing the arithmetic of a marriage and arriving in real time at the true sum of it. Her husband had not looked at her when he ran. He had not said her name, had not reached for her hand, had not done anything in those 2 seconds of decision except calculate the fastest route to the drainage corridor. She was not part of his plan. She had never been part of his plan. I watched her understand that. I watched it move through her face the way weather moves across open water, fast, visible, and complete. The coffee cup slipped. She caught it with one hand, but the keys, she had been holding them in the same hand. The keys to a house that had never belonged to her, the keys did not catch. They fell from her fingers and hit the marble floor of the front hall, and the sound they made was loud and bright and exact in the way that only real things are, a sound, without echo, without drama, without anything except the simple physics of metal on stone. They lay on the floor between us. Nobody moved to pick them up. I looked at the keys. I looked at my daughter's face, at the tears that were coming now, whether she wanted them or not, tracking silently down both cheeks, her jaw trembling, her hands shaking so badly that the coffee cup rattled against itself. She was looking at the floor where the keys had fallen with the expression of someone who has just watched something end and cannot yet locate the beginning of whatever comes next. I stood up from my chair. I walked across the front hall of my home, past Amelia with her documents, past the agents, past Victor and Elaine, who had gone very still and very small. And I crouched down and picked up Emily's keys from the marble floor. I straightened and held them out to her. She looked at them in my hand, and then she looked at my face, and her whole body shook with a sob. She was trying and failing to contain her shoulders, heaving her breath, coming in ragged pulls, the full weight of everything she had done and everything that was about to happen, landing on her all at once in the front hall of the house she had taken from her father. I put the keys in her hand and closed her fingers around them. "You're going to need a good lawyer," I said quietly. "Don't use Daniel's." She pressed her fist with the keys against her mouth and closed her eyes and wept. And then from somewhere below our feet, from the depth of the drainage corridor that ran under the house I had built for Margaret, came Ryan's radio on the table beside Amelia, and through it 2 words in a voice I would have recognized anywhere. Calm as a man announcing breakfast. "Down here." Ryan picked up the radio and said, "Copy," and that was all. 2 agents moved toward the basement stairs. I stayed where I was beside Emily, who was still standing in the middle of the front hall with her fist pressed against her mouth and tears running down her face in steady, silent rivers. Victor sat heavily on the bottom step of the main staircase, and Elaine crouched beside him with both hands on his arm, and neither of them was talking anymore. The room had gone to that particular stillness that follows the moment when everything that was going to happen has happened, and everyone present is waiting to find out what comes next. 4 minutes later, Daniel Marsh came up from the basement. I was not walking under his own direction. Two federal agents had him by the arms, one on each side, and he was moving the way people move when they've stopped making decisions about their own locomotion legs, working body upright, but the particular quality of agency entirely absent. His shirt was damp with sweat, and there was a scrape along his left forearm from somewhere in the tunnel, and his face was doing something I had not expected. I was not angry. He was not defiant. He looked, and I searched for the right word, and kept arriving at the same one, diminished, like a thing that had been inflated by its own confidence for so long that the sudden absence of it had left the structure uncertain of its shape. He came through the basement door and into the front hall, and he looked at Victor and Elaine first. Elaine made a sound and reached toward him, and the agent on his right stepped smoothly between them without breaking stride. Then Daniel turned his head and looked at Emily. She was looking back at him with an expression I had never seen on her face in the 8 years I had known her as my daughter's husband. Not fury, not devastation, something colder than either of those. Something that had moved past the heat of feeling and arrived at the bedrock beneath it. She had stopped crying. Her jaw was set. She held his gaze for exactly 3 seconds, and then she turned away deliberately and completely, the way you turn away from something you are finished with. Daniel looked at me. I looked back at him, and I felt not triumph, not satisfaction, not any of the things I might have expected to feel in this moment. What I felt was tired. Enormously, profoundly tired, the specific exhaustion of a man who has carried something heavy for a long time and has finally been allowed to set it down. The agents walked him out through the front door. The morning light caught him as he crossed the threshold. Bright Florida sun, the kind that makes everything look more vivid than it actually is, and then he was gone. Ryan came up from the basement a few minutes later, brushing dust from his sleeve. He looked at me and gave a single nod. Behind him came Marcus, moving at his own pace, unhurried, straightening his navy jacket with both hands as he came through the basement door into the light. He looked exactly as he had when we'd left the hotel 3 hours ago, composed, precise, the posture of a man who has done what he came to do. He crossed the front hall and stopped beside me, and he looked around the room at the agents, at the Marshes, at Emily, standing alone near the window, and then he looked at me, and the expression on his face was one I did not have adequate words for. Not satisfaction. Something quieter than that. Something that had been waiting 25 years to arrive and had finally found its moment. "Good morning, Mr. Whitmore," he said. Despite everything, I almost laughed. "Good morning, Marcus." Amelia informed Victor and Elaine that they were under arrest under federal statute and read them their Miranda rights in the same clear, carrying voice she used for everything, while an agent placed Victor's hands behind his back and Elaine began to cry in earnest, a high, bewildered sound that bounced off the marble and the high ceilings and eventually faded. Emily was not arrested on the property. Amelia had arranged for her to report to the Sarasota County Sheriff's Office voluntarily at 10 o'clock that morning. Accompanied by an attorney, Amelia had arranged on her behalf 3 days earlier. Emily left through the front door without speaking to anyone. At the threshold, she paused for just a moment, and I thought she might turn back, but she didn't. She walked out into the morning light, and the door closed behind her, and I stood in the front hall of my house and listened to the sound of her car starting in the drive and pulling away. Ryan stood beside me. "It's done," he said. I looked around the front hall, the marble floors, the high ceilings, the light coming through the windows, at the angle that Margaret had loved on Thursday mornings. The mirror the Marshes had hung where there had been nothing before. The furniture moved 4 feet in the wrong direction. "Not quite," I said. but close. Amelia appeared at my shoulder. She looked at me with the careful, precise attention she gave to everything important. "What now, Mr. Whitmore?" I looked at the front hall of my house. I looked at Marcus standing in the light. "Now, Paul?" "Now," I said, "I figure out what it's for. I didn't sell the villa. I didn't keep it either, not in the way you keep something you intend to live in, not in the way I had lived in it before, walking its 11 rooms, in the dark at 3 in the morning, with a plate of food I forgot to eat, and the specific loneliness of a man who has too much space and not enough reason to fill it." The federal case moved faster than I expected, which Ryan told me was unusual and which Amelia told me was a function of the evidence being in her precise formulation overwhelming. Daniel Marsh entered a plea agreement 4 months after his arrest, 18 years in a federal facility, no parole eligibility for the first 12. Victor and Elaine followed 6 weeks later, 12 years each. Dr. Whitfield surrendered his medical license voluntarily and received a suspended sentence in exchange for his cooperation, which Amelia told me was the best available outcome and which I accepted without comment because I had stopped having strong feelings about James Whitfield sometime around the 3rd month. He had done a terrible thing, and he had tried to correct it, and he was going to have to live with the distance between those two facts for the rest of his life, which seemed sufficient. Emily received 5 years, reduced to 3, with credit for cooperation. She had reported voluntarily that morning as arranged, and her attorney, a woman Amelia had recommended, and who turned out to be very good, had negotiated aggressively on her behalf. I did not attend any of her proceedings. I did not submit a victim impact statement. Amelia asked me twice if I was certain about that, and both times I said yes, and both times I meant it. I saw Judge Arthur Brennan once in the hallway outside the sentencing hearing for Daniel. He was coming out of a different courtroom when I arrived, and he stopped and looked at me for a moment, with the particular attention of a man searching his memory for context. Then he said, "Whitmore, you built this courthouse." "The South Wing," I said. 1993. He nodded slowly. "Good work," he said, and walked on. That was all. It was enough. The villa was released from federal freeze 7 months after the arrest, once the evidentiary process was complete, and Amelia had filed the necessary paperwork to clear the title. I had known for some time what I wanted to do with it. I had known if I was honest since the moment I'd stood in the front hall on the morning everything ended and looked at the light coming through the windows at the angle Margaret had loved. I gave it to a foundation, not as a residence, not as a rental property, not as anything that would generate income or carry my name on a tax return. I donated the villa and its grounds to a nonprofit organization that worked to recover, restore, and publicly display cultural artifacts repatriated from private collections. Artifacts like the ones that had spent 3 years moving through my basement in the dark. The foundation renamed it the Margaret Whitmore Heritage Museum, which had been my one condition stated once and not negotiated. The wine cellar became a conservation laboratory. The drainage corridor, the tunnel Daniel had built for darkness, was sealed at the dock end and converted into a climate-controlled storage facility for artifacts awaiting restoration. The private dock became a public access point for the waterfront walking path the city had been trying to extend for 11 years. Marcus became the operations director. He had not asked for the position, and I had not exactly offered it. I had simply called him and told him what I was planning, and said I needed someone who knew every inch of the building and trusted its bones, and he had said after a pause that lasted exactly long enough, "I'll need an office with a window." "The study," I said. "Ground floor, faces the water." "That'll do," he said. Nora flew down for the opening. She stood beside me in front of the entrance where a bronze plaque had been mounted to the left of the main doors. Margaret Whitmore Heritage Museum, established in her memory and in the belief that what belongs to history belongs to everyone. Nora read it twice and pressed her lips together hard, and then said she would have rolled her eyes at the formal language. She would have loved it, I said. She would have loved it, and rolled her eyes at it simultaneously, Nora said. That was her particular gift. I opened the music box. The melody rose into the warm morning air, thin and clear, and entirely itself the same notes. It had always been the same song. Marcus had remembered her humming on those quiet Thursday mornings, while the light came through the window at exactly the right angle. Several people nearby turned to look, and I didn't explain it because it didn't need explaining. Marcus stood beside me. We listened until the mechanism ran down. Then he said, "Shall we go in?" I looked at the bronze plaque. I looked at the doors standing open, and the people moving through them, and the light inside falling across the floors of a house that had held so many things, love and grief and theft and patience, and eventually, after a long time, something closer to purpose than I had expected to find at 67 years old. "Yes," I said. "Let's go in." We go on Thursday mornings now, Marcus and I. We sit at the end of the old dock, the public dock, the city's dock, the one anyone can use, and we drink coffee and watch the water. And don't say much, because after a certain number of years in a person's company, you don't always need to. The light on the water in the morning is the same light it has always been. I'm still learning how to be in one place long enough to deserve it. People ask me what I learned from all of this. I learned that family stories, revenge is never really about the house. It is about the day you stop letting other people write your story for you. I spent 3 years being managed, moved, and quietly erased by people who called themselves family. Don't do what I did. Don't wait. Don't excuse it. Don't tell yourself patience is the same as wisdom, because family drama revenge begins the moment someone mistakes your silence for surrender. I believe God places certain people in our lives exactly when we need them most. For me, it was a sister who flew through the night, a lawyer who asked the right question, and a man who waited 25 years and never once stopped showing up. My honest opinion, the most dangerous thing a good person can do is stay quiet long enough for someone else to make their decisions for them. Stories like mine, family stories, revenge at its core, happen because decent people wait too long to say enough. Family drama revenge doesn't end with a courtroom. It ends the morning you wake up and remember that your life belongs to you. And every family story's revenge story comes down to one question: what are you willing to do the day you finally decide to matter? If this reached you, leave a comment. Share it with someone who needs it. Subscribe, the next story is already waiting. Thank you for staying until the end. What follows contains fictional elements built for reflection. If that's not your space, choose your peace and go well.